Welcome to Visions, a documentary program geared towards informing the public about St. Martin persons who have achieved significance in a particular area and therefore could be considered a role model, a hero or heroine. I am your host, LB Scot. Lionel Bernard Scott was born on January 28, 1897, in St. Martin to Eliza Constance Garot and John Francis Scott. He was reared in the Margaret Hill region in St. Peters. During the time of LB's youth, St. Martin was a post-slavery society, with only a couple thousand people, divided mostly in two categories, the old white and rich families and the black underclass. In the early 1900s, St. Martin was an agricultural society, though there were some villages like Phillipsburg and Simpson Bay that depended on fishing. Both aspects were meant not only to feed the family, but also these products were sold. Back then, just about everyone had a ground to grow bananas, yams, potatoes, to whatever else they needed. They also had goats, cattle, and sometimes a horse or a donkey. There was no real educational system on St. Martin until 1960s. There were a few schools, some in town like the St. Joseph and Orania schools, one in Simpson Bay, and others in the cul-de-sac area for the less privileged children. Everyone back in those days survived by having a little shop or some business activity from their home. Everyone had a piece of yard space. Everyone bought and sold from each other, the people they knew. It was a time, some would say, that whenever you did something wrong, you were corrected twice. Once from the person who saw you doing something wrong, and again from your parents. Today is different. This was a time of LB Scot. In this broadcast, we shall take a look at who LB Scot was. We talked to several people, and they would tell you what kind of man he was, starting from the beginning.
LB Scot was born on St. Martin. He was from Margaret Hill, as they usually call it. He was born in the year 1897. That's the post-slave era. And as you're aware, slavery was abolished in 1863 by the Dutch, and so he came right after slavery. And his parents were John Francis Scott and Eliza Giraud, and they were both from St. Martin. He attended school in cul-de-sac. Right opposite Fathom, in that building there. That was a schoolhouse. He always told me that that's the way he attended school. Well, education was always one of his, his passions, because when he went to school, things were rough in those days. They came from a poor family, and like I explained earlier, a post-slave era. Black people in those days had very little, but you had the opportunity to get an education, and he did very well in school. And after school, he went to work at the age of 14, because that's the time he came out of school in those days. And from there, he then moved on to Santo Domingo at the age of 20, and he remained there until 1937. After that, he returned to St. Martin to make his contribution to his island.
Migration was not a new experience. In this world, people have always traveled for reason of trade, exploration, or to escape prosecution, to find jobs, to make life better for themselves. In the Caribbean, people moved where they could find work or to be closer to their families. Thus, the Caribbean islands, Central and North America, including Curacao and Aruba, became destinations where St. Martiners went away in order to better their lives. They worked hard, experienced discrimination, but they persevered as best they could on the cane fields in Cuba and the Dominican Republic, in the trenches of the Panama Canal, doing construction or whatever other work they could find.
Yes, in those days, the sugarcane industry was very prominent in Santo Domingo, and like most St. Martiners of that era, they moved to Santo Domingo for a better life. It was, to better their lives. And during his stay in Santo Domingo, he learned carpentry. At first, he worked on the railroads in the cane industry, and then he moved from there into the construction industry, and he learned that trade. As a matter of fact, before he left St. Martin, he was already a carpenter. So he ended up doing the job that he knew better, which was carpentry.
But what I've heard of Mr. Scott is that most of his abilities, concerning construction that he learned those in Santo Domingo. In Santo Domingo, they said he was a chief foreman down there, and you don't go Santo Domingo and become a chief foreman if you don't have abilities. That is being versatile, being able to do lots of things under different situations, and he was quite competent in that.
After LB returned to St. Martin in 1929, he began his construction career, building some iconic buildings, the Methodist Manse, the Princess Bernard Bridge, the first airport, among numerous other buildings.
I think in the construction era, one of the first buildings that he built that is still standing today is the Methodist Manse. He shaped that from scratch. He built it, and up until today it's still standing, and it's one of the better buildings on St. Martin. It has endured hurricane after hurricane. It's still standing. And he also did buildings as public works, because in those days the Windward Island was one, and he worked on St. Martin as well as Sabre and on Statia. And the public works department, which he headed at that time, they constructed the school in Statia. They also did the government building in Sabre. So there were several buildings that he built on Sabre and Statia.
Yeah, well, Mr. Scot was active on all three islands, you know, and that is why you can admire Mr. Scot so much, because don't forget in the days that when he was growing up, St. Martin was owned by the old white families like the Van Romonts, the Percivals, the Brouwers. They were the kingpins of St. Martin, Dutch and French side. And so for a black person coming up in those days to get involved in business, it was quite an achievement. And I remember when they celebrated the 100th anniversary of his birth, they had made a little booklet at the time, you know, and when you see photos of Mr. Scot when he was a young man in his 20s, you could see that he had something in him. And so when he returned from Santo Domingo, that he got in the construction business, I remember he built that lovely home for the Methodist minister behind the Methodist church there in Phillipsburg. But why I suggested that you also come to Sabre and Statia, because a lot of St. Martin people would not realize that Mr. Scot was busy on all three islands. Here in Sabre, he built the administration building, which is now the library. Next to that, where the old age home is, he built what used to be known as the receiver's office, the receiver's house. It is part of the old home now. On the Fort Bay, the former Harbour Masters of building, which is still standing, he also built that. He built the reservoir here in the hill in the bottom. He also built one in Windward side. And so he was quite active. In my old archives home, I have a photo of him standing on the old pier that he built also in 1934.
Essentially, Mr. Scot was involved in the first place in construction, because that was the foundation of his actual business life. From there, he branched out into various other areas. He established a hardware store in the cul-de-sac area where he originated. He also had a lemonade factory, which he also operated. And one of the things that he was also very known for was when he branched out into the gasoline service, which was the Esso service station, which was established on the Bush Road, and which today is a Texaco, a Shell gas station actually. So those were essentially the four main businesses that he was involved in, branching out mainly from his construction business, which essentially made him strong in business. In addition to that, he also did quite some agricultural and and farming, which he had a great love for, so he spent quite a bit of time in that type of activity as well.
Construction allowed him to expand into other areas, to diversify and not depend on one pillar of his business activities.
From what I can recollect as a businessman, he was pretty successful in what he did, because he set out in life, he was a driven person. You know, people who are driven, they usually succeed at whatever they set out to do. He had a lemonade factory. He was also involved in gasoline, in a gasoline station. He was the first SO distributor on the island at that time. He was also involved in tiles, making tiles. He was making blocks. He believed in manufacturing, doing things that would eventually benefit everyone. And then he was also into agriculture and animal husbandry. So those are some of the things that he was involved in.
Well, when you, in the first place, you need to you need to think back in time. Mr. Scot was essentially came from very humble beginnings. He was born in 1897. That was basically shortly after slavery, and within a very large family. Namely, he had some 6 brothers and 10 sisters, to give you an idea. And it is from that background, after and in the environment that the setting that he came from, Mr. Scot having a pretty having it from an economic perspective, the Scot family having a pretty tough time. Mr. Scot at a very early age had to start working, and actually traveled to Santo Domingo, and that's where he learned the construction business and returned to St. Martin.
But besides his successes as a contractor and as a businessman, we have to look at the man himself. What kind of person was LB?
As a father, I can say he was a very strict father, and education was foremost in his mind. As a matter of fact, as an example, I can remember getting up at 5 o'clock every morning at the age of 10. You had to get up in the morning, you had to do your chores. You had to cut grass for his horses because he was a lover of horses. That's one of his passions. And you had to clean his car. You had to take out the goats. After you did that, you get ready for school, you go to school. He was a disciplinarian. You couldn't talk back. There were certain aspects of him were very dictatorial. And today you realize that he had the right principles and the right morals, to go along with the time, because he knew what it was all about. He realized that there was no success without sacrifice, and he made you learn that, from a very young age. And up until today, I like to work. I can't stand not working, but I started working from a very young age. But that was the norm. To some people today, they hear that, that was the norm. Today, children are not used to that kind of discipline, but in those days, that was the norm. Each and every one of us had to work. I think he was stern and compassionate. He wanted what was best for you. So what he did was guide you in that direction. I left school in St. Martin at the age of 10 to go to Curacao because he had a plan. And his plan was for me to go to Curacao. I had a brother who was in Curacao at that time and who was doing very well. He stayed with one of his sisters. And he thought that his sister was doing a great job with my brother. And he said, you have to go to Curacao because Dutch was the thing in those days. And in St. Martin, we were learning Dutch as well.
LB not only wanted the best for himself and his family, but also for the community.
He knew that only through education that they would achieve in life what so many people worked hard for. Without the education, you don't achieve anything. And he instilled in them pride and dignity. If you want a good day's pay, you must give a good day's work. And you should be proud of your identity, be proud of who you are, be a proud St. Martiner, and try to reach the ultimate goals.